Thanks very much for joining us today, Kavita, and for running our workshop on research and evaluation methods, designs, tools, and techniques. Thanks very much for leading us in this workshop on quantitative methods. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Bev, for having me and giving me this opportunity. And well, welcome everybody. So although this workshop or a webinar sort of a thing, I'm not going to make you work on any questions, so there'll be no quizzes as such, but I'll try to walk you through some of the basics of research and evaluation methods, methodology. So a couple of weeks ago when Bev and I started talking about what could be some potential webinar topics where students kind of feel stuck. And Bev immediately said, I think a quantitative high-level methodology webinar would be really useful because one, I'm already teaching 660 and I get these questions oftentimes, well, how do you choose the right question? How do you frame a question? How do you even come to a question? How do you conduct literature review? And what is the process? So I thought, I think this would be a good opportunity to reintroduce the process of conducting research and evaluation and talk about the differences between research and evaluation. Most often, these two terms are confused and they are conflated. And I come from a grants world in the sense that I conduct evaluations of grants that are funded by the federal agencies like National Science Foundation, US Department of Ed, NASA, Department of Defense, and so on and so forth. And they most often, especially in National Science Foundation, requires a separate research and a separate evaluation section. And most of the grants, they get really low points because there's a conflation between the two. So I'll very quickly walk through the differences between the two. And then we'll talk a little bit about the design. What is the process of conducting research? And then what are the processes that are used to conduct evaluation? Pretty much they are the same, but once you know the difference between the two, and you can follow that. We'll talk about some of the data collection methods. The most common method that you are all using already is the survey methods, so survey design. What are some of the common do's and don'ts? Although it won't be an exercise as to, well, pick a right question or pick a wrong question, but I'll just give you some high-level do's and don'ts about what constitutes a good survey. How many questions should you have in a survey? I'll also share some of the references, and then the slide deck actually has several designs which go into much further detail. So if we have time and if there is an interest, we can talk about the designs one by one, or in any case, you will have access to all the slides and you could go through them whenever you have a moment and whenever you want to use them. In addition, there was also an interest by some of the students who said, well, we also want to learn beyond the regular SPSS and Excel. So what are some of the other tools that are available to researchers who conduct quantitative analysis? So I'm going to go very quickly through some of the tools that I use in my own work, which you could also learn, and there are some resources available for that as well. So I'm estimating that now it's about 7:05, 7:08. I'll go slowly through the slides and maybe half an hour or maybe 35 minutes of presentation. I'll pause. Feel free to put in your questions in the chat box. And, Bev, feel free to interrupt me and say, hey, we have some fantastic questions on survey design. Let's just take a pause and take those questions. So it's very informal. Don't be shy. Ask me questions. Let's do a quick poll so that we get to know you better. So the first question I have is, have you taken at least one statistics course at American University or any other university? Yes or no? Do we have a poll already launched?
It looks like people are putting it in the chat box.
Okay.
So it's a mix.
Mm-hmm. So maybe about 50%, we have 20 participants.
I would say probably 75% have taken stats.
Excellent. Okay. And how comfortable are you with conducting a quantitative study?
So it's half-half between not at all or somewhat.
Got it. Okay. So looks like this is going to be a perfect webinar to those who have and those who have not. But fear not. There will be no quiz, or you will not be graded. So just relax and enjoy enjoy the webinar. All right. So the first item that I really wanted to talk to you all about is the differences, the fundamental difference between research and evaluation. At least I'm assuming that in your practice, you may not have this kind of a problem where you are invited to conduct either or, like conduct a research study, but not an evaluation study, or conduct an evaluation study, but don't worry about the research. So this is generally for, I think, those students or alumni who have been in the evaluation program, and oftentimes they may come across this term, well, what is the difference? They seem to be pretty much doing the same stuff. The short answer is yes. So this hourglass actually is lifted from AEA, American Evaluation Association, and this was actually done by my friend, John Leavell. He is an excellent evaluator who is also an evaluation professor at the University of Minnesota. And he's the one who kindly said, lift it. It doesn't matter, because this one is one of the most popular images that differentiates very clearly, to some extent, the differences between the two. In a sense, research is out there which seeks to generate new knowledge, new information, as compared to evaluation, which is really looking for a high level decision making and which is very stakeholder focused. For instance, if you are in a program, your stakeholders would be your participants. It could be the leadership circle. It could be your executive, the CEO, the CFO, what have you. Those are your stakeholders. And you want to evaluate or assess the effectiveness or the impact of a program, of a training, or what have you. Research, on the other hand, is more researcher focused, in the sense that the researcher is really interested to look at the nuances, look at the moderating variables. He's really looking at the affective behavioral changes, and it's very participant focused. Especially since I come from the education field, for me, a research study would really entail my looking at the students' performance, teachers' reaction to a training program, a professional development session. That would be my research. And evaluation-wise, as an educator, I would be looking at the overall program. How is the program delivering what it is supposed to be delivering? So those are the main fundamental differences between research and evaluation. And where do they really come together is in the methods and analysis. As most of you know, that the methods are always standard. That's the backbone in terms of, well, are you doing a qualitative study? Are you doing a quantitative study? Are you doing the mixed methods? Those methods are always the backbone. Where it really differentiates is, what are your research questions? What are your evaluation questions? And what is the intent and purpose and unit of analysis? That's where it differentiates between research and evaluation. So let me pause for a minute and see if we have any questions here, because I think this is a really important slide, and this is where people often get confused.
We don't have any questions coming in, but I know one of the questions we oftentimes get is around validity and reliability of data. Okay. And is there any difference between the two?
Okay.
And Talata is asking, does research always generate new knowledge?
In a sense, yes. The idea of conducting research is the expectation is you are either generating new knowledge, any knowledge. It could be new knowledge or it's building upon some existing knowledge. You can also generalize some findings. Suppose if you did research in a school district in rural America, and you want to make sure, or you want to see if those results that you received or you actually found from that school district in rural America, they can be generalizable to an urban or suburban scenario. So you are generating new kind of information, new kind of findings, because the context has changed from one location to the other. But that can also apply to evaluation. But remember, the methods and analysis are pretty much the same. It's who are you kind of reporting to, and what are your research and evaluation questions is where the difference lies. Should I move to the next slide?
Yep, I think move on.
Okay. Now, this slide, I think, is the most often used, and this is where I would probably spend a lot of my time. So I had an office hour just before this presentation, and one of the students very nicely asked, well, so I have this data. I want to explore some medical no-shows, but I don't know what my question is. What am I really looking for? So the short answer is that you are really looking at the design. How do you come up with a question? How do you develop the question? What is the problem? So first of all, I know that her topic of area is medical no-shows, medical appointment no-shows. So that's the topic area of interest that she really wants to investigate. What is the problem? Now, she works in a medical health institution or organization. And in her work experience in the past 3 or 4 years, she mentioned, she observed that a certain age group of a certain gender, they are not showing up for their medical appointments on certain days. And she wants to know why. So that's the statement of problem. So what is that need? Now, how do you actually learn if that problem really exists or not? It's not coming out of thin air, but there is some research that ought to be there, which has already generated this kind of topic of interest. That's where you conduct a lit review. She went back and she said, well, I found some interesting literature on this topic on medical no-shows in the Journal of Public Health. And you know what? I found out that males in the age group of 70 and 75s, they seem to be basically, those with diabetes and hypertension. They are the ones who have the maximum percentage of no-shows on Mondays and Tuesdays. And that's what the research said. And I said, well, that's great, but then that's what research says, but what does your data say? She said, yeah, well, that's what I want to find out. So she developed a research question or an evaluation question, which was something like, she had 2 or 3 questions, if I can recall correctly. She said, well, so the question that she came up with was, what is the behavior pattern of no-shows of a certain age group and gender in a hospital setup in rural Arizona, something of that sort. So that was a question that she wanted to really find out using a data set of medical no-shows. I said, that's great. Then how is she going to find the responses to her question? The study design or approach was, she said, well, I just have this sample, this data sample. I'm going to do some basic analysis and also pull some data from literature. So I'm going to do quantitative and qualitative and just one sample design, because that sample has already been given to her in the form of a data set. I said, great. Then the kind of analysis that I'm going to do is, because I want to see if there is any relationship between age, gender, race, ethnicity, and health condition, which would be diabetes and hypertension, I could probably do a correlation study. So there you have it. You have a topic of interest, you have statement of problem, you confirmed it with literature review, you have a research question or two, then you have a study design, a single case, a single sample post design. Data collection will be in the form of a pre-existing extant data from the data set. The analysis would be descriptives, frequency, and correlation. And then she's going to report out the information and either do a presentation or disseminate to her boss or whoever that she's reporting out to. So those are the basic design steps. And this is pretty much common and fairly across research, evaluation study, market research, what have you. You will see that this is the basic steps. These are the basic steps that anyone would follow. And it's never linear. So don't think that one thing leads to the other. It's always iterative. Sometimes what happens is that you have a topic, but you don't have enough, you're not able to find the gap, or you're not able to find that need. So you have to keep thinking and keep reading additional literature to make sure that you have that topic of interest and you are able to find that need and gap so that you can move forward in developing research evaluation questions and so on and so forth. So this is the process. Let me pause. Any questions, concerns?
There's nothing popping up in the chat, so I think we're good.
Okay. Or either I've overwhelmed and we have only you and me just participating in the webinar now. Talking to each other. All right. So in a sense, there are some basic designs that for most part, all researchers and evaluators would use. The most common one that I mentioned was and is one group post-test only, especially when you have one sample and you are just doing a post-test in terms of after the intervention is done to find out the level of satisfaction, their perceptions, their participation, change in knowledge, growth, what have you. Then you have one group pre-test and post-test. Now, this is pretty popular, especially when it comes to training. And in education, we do this a lot, especially when we have a pre-test and a post-test in terms of assessments. We have a fall assessment, then we have a winter assessment, a spring assessment. We want to see some kind of change. And this is also known as a paid t-test, where you're comparing the pre-scores, pre-results to the post-results with the hope that there is a statistical difference between the pre and the post results to make sure that maybe that intervention has some kind of effect, a small effect, a big effect, and that the intervention is indeed working to the extent possible. Then there is a post-test only non-equivalent groups, which I'm going to talk in a little bit details. Now, all these three designs are considered weak designs because they are generally non-experimental, but they are called weak experimental designs. Because when we say experimental design, it means that you have a comparison group, you have a control group. I mean, these days with COVID and vaccine, I'm pretty sure you've heard of the term randomized controlled trial. That's very common in clinical studies, but in social sciences, in education, in health, and all the other areas, it's very, very difficult to do a randomized controlled trial. So what we generally do is quasi-experimental design, where the comparison group really is not randomly chosen, but it's intentionally designed, it's intentionally chosen so that we are comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges. That's fairly common in education from where I come from. And it's very acceptable because people realize that you simply cannot deny services in social services, especially in health, in education, like giving an intervention to a few students, a few groups, and denying the same services to the other group is not fair. It's inhumane. So that's why a quasi-experimental design is far more acceptable. And it also, it yields in pretty good results too. Again, so the non-experimental design, most of us, I think, especially in the assignments and the courses that we have taken and done so far, you will see these are the most common designs used: descriptives, correlational, surveys, a survey design, a causal comparative, longitudinal. Longitudinal is a little difficult, but I would say it's not impossible, especially if you have data sets or data that have been collected by somebody else, and you have data across several phases, several time periods, then you can actually do a longitudinal study. But In real life, if you have a grant that runs for about 5 or 6 years, and then you have data across 4 or 5 years, then you can probably do a pretty decent longitudinal study. So that's where the longitudinal aspect comes in. Then the retrospective, pre-test, and post-test. Now, this happens also quite often in training programs. For instance, you have conducted a training, but for some reason you could not do a pre-test. So what you do is after the training is done, you send them a survey saying that, well, thinking back before doing the training, before attending a session, how did you feel? And then after the session, how do you feel now? Again, all these studies have problems in the sense that there is a selection bias. Also, the problem is that, if I'm extremely happy or extremely sad with a training session, it's more likely that I would either give a very high rating or a very low rating. So it becomes very biased when you do this kind of study. But again, we are human beings, and we don't behave rationally sometimes. The other favorite design of mine is mixed methods. I would always go for a mixed method because you are really using qualitative and quantitative methods, because then you have a much better way of triangulating the data, also finding the story, the what, the how, the why aspects of a study becomes much more easier. And then you have a much more holistic approach to a study when you do a mixed methods design study. Within the mixed methods design, you have a sequential and a concurrent. Concurrent is more viable because due to time restrictions, you end up doing both qualitative and quantitative at the same time, because one study's findings tends to inform the other method's findings, and then you can combine them holistically and report out. So this is the basic, very high level types of designs that are most common in both research and evaluation fields. Any questions?
Kavita, I think that Judith has a question, and can you maybe pop in and ask it, because I'm not quite sure how you want to word it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Kavita, and thank you to you and Bev for the presentation. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no problem.
It's just because I'm getting a little confused. Like, you started presenting the difference between research and evaluation, but then at some point, especially when you mentioned about the types of questions, and then you mentioned hypothesis for research and questions for evaluation, I was thinking that some research also involve, like qualitative research also involve questions instead of hypotheses. And like some may involve hypotheses, but some also involve questions. And then when you were discussing further, I was just wondering if, so I'm getting confused because I'm trying to make a difference between the method, or maybe it's because I do not understand method properly. But are we talking about method, just method where we differentiate qualitative and quantitative, or are we talking about evaluation and research?
So we're actually talking about everything here, Judith. Great question. And, I'm glad that you asked because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the often asked question, the FAQ, and also the often confused term. So it really depends on what exactly you're trying to investigate. So give me an example from your work, and I can tell you if it's more research oriented or if it's more evaluation oriented. And then maybe we can kind of talk through the process and see where we are.
Okay, so I work in environmental and social sustainability, and then we do that. It's just making sure that investment or infrastructure investment project globally do not harm people. And then we have a set of policy that we try to enforce in country and in various teams. But then the objective is to ensure that the project like the project involved resettling people and physical and economic displacement. But then the policy, the objective is that after people are displaced, we make sure that their livelihood is not negatively impacted.
Mhm.
So something that we do is like after we implement a project, there's always some monitoring on making sure that people are keeping various dimensions of their livelihood, like income, employment, or social cultural values are maintained from where they were before in the new place.
Mhm.
So, and then we write a report, and sometimes it can involve completion audit, but usually we just monitor that throughout the implementation phase and the completion phase of the project. So that's why I'm a little confused. Like, where do I mean, I don't remember ever in my work making hypotheses. We just go by the what is known about the baseline studies of the socioeconomics of people that we resettled.
Mhm.
And after when they're moved, we try to compare the before and after.
Right. Yeah. Basically, in a sense, what you're doing is you may not be hypothesizing on paper, but what you basically mentioned is you are still hypothesizing in your mind that if we do this, then this happens. Correct, Judith? That if we provide,
Correct.
yeah. So that is the hypothesis. You don't have to write on paper, but in a sense, you want to see if we provide these structures, if we provide infrastructure, if we provide support, money, fundings, resources, then we want to see some kind of outputs and outcomes. So your stakeholders still are the people who are receiving those supports, those resources. But ultimately, when you write a report, it's an evaluation report because you're reporting out to the main stakeholders, whoever might be your funder, whoever might be your client. It could be your own company, what have you. Does that make
Correct.
sense? Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
right. So research actually is much more pronounced, Judith, when you are actually writing a research paper or you're writing a grant. So I wanted to give a much fuller picture that when research can be more viable and where evaluation, especially in the evaluation field like you and me, we would straight away go for evaluation of a program, of an intervention, of an effort. But research would be when we are looking in the education field, it's very, very common where you are looking at those cognitive changes, you're looking at metacognitive changes or affective behavioral changes in students. That's very research because it is very focused on the students, very focused on those participant level indicators and variables, while
Yeah.
evaluation is the overall approach, overall program, and exactly what you are doing would be more evaluation.
All right. Thank you.
And then Kavita, if you could get back to your design slide, there was a question. There are differences in terms, are there differences in terms of threats to validity and reliability based on these designs?
They are. So every design will have its threats of validity in terms of, well, how valid is it in a certain environment, in a certain context, and how reliable is the instrument and tool. No design is perfect. That's why I went back to say that, if I were given a choice, I would go with a mixed method design because then the scope of validity errors is minimized or it's far less when I only do an experimental design. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of a study that we concluded 3 years ago with Hopkins. It was a pretty large quasi-experimental design in Baltimore City School District. So we had treatment schools, 9 treatment schools, and 6 comparison schools, in the sense that the schools had students with similar demographics, similar baseline scores in math and reading, and we were tracking them for the next 4 years to see if and when we give them the intervention of inducing science in the elementary classes, grades 3, 4, and 5, do we see any changes or any growth in their science performance when they take the science test or the science assessment in grade 5. And we were also tracking them into middle school to see, well, what is their performance in math, in algebra? Um, are they thinking about STEM careers? What do they think about building something? So that was the quantitative aspect of it. But then we were also backing our quantitative data with interviews, with observations, with focus groups, so that we have a much more holistic approach to the what, the why, the when, the how. I think there is no design that has ever been developed or invented which doesn't have any problems, because the problem per se is not in the design per se, but it's how you implement. You will always have the problem of sample size. You will have a big problem of attrition, meaning that you will be losing participants. And that happens fairly often. So when you lose participants in a large study like we did for Hopkins, we were losing about 2 to 5% of students every grade. Why was this happening? Well, because we were dealing with high mobility population. Students were moving from one school to the other, and not only students, but also teachers were moving. They were, some of them were losing their jobs, or some of them were just moving. The other interesting thing, which was the unintended consequence of this design, was that some of the high performing schools, they performed even better. So there's a selection bias, and so they very happily moved the high performing teachers into a low performing school because they wanted to bring them both at the same level. So it really is not the validity of the design, but it really, there are so many contextual factors that are beyond your control. That's why we say that to the extent possible, use different methods of data collection, because that way you have much more buffer to cover some of these validity issues.
And then there's the question on the sequential and the concurrent mixed methods design.
Sure.
You could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. So I have several slides on that, but I can very quickly talk about sequential and concurrent. The most popular one is concurrent. The sequential is like in sequence. You do one qualitative first, and then you're followed by quantitative. Or you can do quantitative first, and then you can do qualitative to basically make sure that the responses or the findings kind of stick together. That's a sequential. It's not very popular, but people do use this depending on their sample, depending on what their research questions are, how they want to conduct the study, also on resources and budget. Now, concurrent is far more popular in evaluation, mainly because you don't have a lot of time to wait on one result to come and then you go and jump into the next one. So concurrently, what you do is you are administering a survey. And at the same time, you're also doing follow-up phone calls, you're doing some focus groups. So you're doing two things together. And when the results come through, you're comparing them to make sure that they're all kind of sticking together and they're telling the story in unison. So that's, in a sense, the mixed methods design.
I think that's all I've got for now.
Got it. Okay. So let's spend some time going through the data collection methods, because this is, again, an interesting topic and most commonly used, and across all the courses, 660, then you have qualitative methods, you have quantitative methods, the 660, I think the mixed methods. So basically all of us have to do some kind of data collection in our courses. And all of them. Interviews, that would be, qualitative. Observations, again, qualitative. But mind you, in observation, if you're going in with a rubric, you're quantizing your qualitative observation. But you, the researcher, is going there with a rubric, with a scoring, some kind of a scoring sheet. Then surveys. Now, interestingly, some people would say that, oh, but surveys are very qualitative. And most of them will say, no, it's a quantitative method. My take on this is it really depends on the type of questions you're asking in a survey. Now, some people will say that the surveys were completely open-ended, but I did an online survey. Well, that's a qualitative measure that you used. But if you use a combination of both qualitative questions, like closed questions with Likert-based questions, strongly disagree, agree, and disagree, then neutral, agree, and strongly agree, that means that you're quantizing your opinions into a Likert scale, and that becomes a quantitative method. My take again with surveys is one, keep it simple and have a mix of both qualitative and quantitative, in the sense open-ended and closed-ended questions, because then sometimes a binary yes no does not give you a fair picture of what you're trying to find. And then it also becomes very boring when you have a lengthy survey and you only have yes no, strongly agree, strongly disagree, and then you're like, well, I don't think I understand, well, why are they saying strongly disagree? I want to know more. So I would also include a question: if you have checked strongly disagree for this question, would you care to comment why? So that way you also get some open comments to that particular question. Then usage data is basically the extant data, secondary analysis, secondary data. Somebody else has collected that data already for you, and then you are, doing some secondary analysis um, based on what your research question is, what your problem statement is, and then you're just conducting analysis and writing a report. For the 660 people, it would be all very familiar because what we are doing is usage data from the various data sets. Focus groups, again, where you have a bunch of people, a group of people, and you're asking open-ended questions. It could be structured or it could be unstructured, informal, what have you, but you have a group of people and you're really asking them questions so that you can gather information from them. But the most common one, I think Bev also wanted me to talk a little bit more about surveys. So let's talk a little bit about surveys, unless anyone has any questions on these. And again, remember that these data collection methods are common across research and evaluation. So to do this question, are we talking about methods or are we talking about research and evaluation? Look at it at a top level, and then going down to the hourglass is where there is a merging of methods, because methods are pretty much the backbone for whatever kind of work that you do, either research or evaluation or both. Okay, so I think we all know why we do surveys: when we are trying to measure or assess an attitude, a perception, engagement, satisfaction. In a sense, surveys are very perceptual, and they are measuring in a point of time an experience. I mean, all of us have received surveys, and I think most of us have administered a survey. It could be a 5-question survey where you go to Macy's, you do shopping, you don't have a great experience, and there you go in 2 days, you receive a survey. Well, how was your experience? Well, it sucked. And then they will not send you a survey again. If you have a great experience, well, sometimes they will say, here you go, you get $5 coupon and you can use it the next time. And then you realize that you're supposed to spend $100 to get $5 off. So that's a trick. Now the pilot is, well, okay, let me back up here. So when you do surveys, especially for large studies, for example, Judith mentioned about this really large study, how can she make sure that that survey that she's going to administer is going to be a reliable tool? So before going out into the field, we generally say that, if you have time, if you have some planning time, set aside, develop the survey and pre-test your survey on a small group. If you have the privilege of, having a smaller sample from a bigger sample of your study, then send that survey out to them and tell them, well, what do you think about the survey questions? How long did it take you to complete the survey? And do you want any changes to be made to the survey? Basically, you want to know how reliable that tool is. Is the survey asking the questions that it is supposed to ask? And what is your level of interaction with that survey? So I would highly, highly recommend, if you have an opportunity, before launching that big survey out to say 500 people, look for a way to pilot your survey. You don't have to necessarily come up with a subsample, But you could also look for some friends, some colleagues, do a purposeful sample, gather them together in a lunchroom situation, give the survey out and say, well, in 2 days, I want to know what you think about the survey. The mode of administration, well, thank God for that. Now we are accepting more online surveys as compared to paper surveys, which are a complete pain to enter the data, do the analysis, do the cleaning, and whatnot. So online service is the most common mode of administration of a survey. And then there's a hybrid and the digital tool. Now, another thing that's really picking up is using a hybrid format where, especially in a school scenario, well, I work in rural school districts, or I work in areas where students or the parents, they just don't have that much of cell phone access, or they just want to save their minutes and they don't want to use it to complete long surveys. So we give them an option. Do you want to complete a survey in paper, or you want us to send a link? So that's the hybrid format. The digital tool, again, if you have an easy access to a small survey, 5 questions, 7-question survey, send it, send a URL, a short link, and they will fill it out and you get the results instantly. So those are the mode of administration. Now, how does a survey look like? If you are conducting a very large, complicated study, then you would have a section of instructions. What is that survey about? You have to tell them what the survey is all about. Then you need to seek a consent. Basically, if there are questions, consent is, in a sense, you are asking them permission, like Bev did before starting the webinar. Last year, she was like, I'm going to record, you'll be here or not. But that's, in a sense, a consent where she's asking you nicely, is it okay if I recorded the session? And if you choose not to be recorded, then turn your camera off. So consent is, I'm asking you of your time. I'm asking permission if I could send the survey, if I could send the survey to you, and if you could respond. And if there are any sensitive questions, feel free to, just return the survey blank, or just, tear it up, what have you. But a consent is really required. And also American University has a pretty extensive institutional review board process. If most of you have gone through the thesis process, capstone project, I think you would have gone through the IRB process as well. So that's pretty critical. Then other things that the survey, the first page would also have, how much time does it take to complete? Are you providing any incentives? Again, it's not mandatory. Incentives come into place where, it's a large study and it is funded by an agency. They have lots of money and they really want to get the numbers up, or it's a marketing company. Nielsen will send you a survey and they will all often be a dollar stuck into it. So I'm being recorded, but what happens is I do not like their questions, but I do take the dollar and I don't respond to the survey. But don't do that. So if a student sends you a survey and says that, I'll put you in a raffle and, you could win a $5 gift certificate, please do them a favor. Just complete the survey, because it is probably for their study. It is probably for their thesis. So help them out. Otherwise, incentives, there is no research which says that if you provide incentive, you're going to get an uptick, or there's going to be a high rate of response. So there is no confirmatory research which says that. However, it says that $1, if you place maybe $1 in the survey, it has the equal effect of placing $5. For instance, if the response rate for $1 is 20% of returns of the survey, it's probably the same for $5 too. So the higher amount of money does not have any effect or any causal effect on the rate of responses. That's actually a good finding. And when you actually really increase the money, say to $20, $30, $40, actually there is a law of diminishing returns, which means that your response rate could actually dip, because those people who are conscientious enough, they would say, well, this is bribery. I'm going to take the money or return the money. So don't think that higher the amount of money is going to actually really give you a great response rate. So there's research by Don Dillman. So if you have a moment, just Google him and you can find some research on the role of incentive on the response rate of surveys, especially when it comes to paper surveys. At the end of the survey, you would always want to include a sentence or two about your contact information or the study director's contact, and always leave a follow-up, either an email or your phone number. Because the thing is, for most part, people will not ask a question, but you should always be available so that it doesn't mean that some ghost has sent the survey and people don't care about it. So it's that personalization really helps in a survey, when it shows that, if for any questions, any concerns, I'm available. This is my phone number. This is my contact information. And I'll get back to you. Any questions here?
There was a question on the name of the author that you shared that did the research on incentives.
Sure. So I have that name in the reference section too, but it's Don Dillman, Dillman, Don as in Donald, Dillman. So he has big books on surveys. One of them is more recent, another one is an older version. But there are also shorter versions, like the Cliff Note kind of version online, but they're really good. So check them out.
And that's all the questions for now.
Excellent.
Oh, one more question. What about the length of the survey? How many questions are optimal?
Very nice. Okay. Well, there you go. So obviously, another important factor in developing surveys, especially when time is of essence and maybe you're not providing any incentive and you just want some response really quickly, then my take on this is a question order and length are super critical. Always, like I do, put the easier ones at the beginning. For example, if you have some simple questions, not the demographic questions, but some questions, the easier ones, but they are very informative, put them right in the beginning. Demographic ones, gender, age, race, ethnicity, those are, one, they are boring, but they're important, but they're also independent variables for your study. If you're conducting one, they should generally be at the end. The reason being, you open a survey and you have these questions on age, gender, and they go on and on and on. By question number 5, I am bored, I have lost interest, and you've wasted my time. I'm like, what do you want to know? So ask me the questions. So that's why ask the questions first. Ask the easier ones in the beginning. Leave the demographic questions towards the end, especially the income questions. Another thing I've learned in my practice is, if you are not using a question in your report, don't ask that question. If income has nothing to do with the kind of study that you're doing, then don't ask, because one, people will lie, and second, you're wasting their time. So don't ask that question unless it's required. Be extremely mindful of DEI related questions, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness questions, especially when it comes to race, ethnicity, and gender. One thing I've learned is always keep an option, especially when it is a multiple choice question. Prefer not to answer, or leave it as other and give them a choice. If they don't want to respond, that's it. They don't want to respond. You cannot force them to respond to any questions. So be very, very mindful of these questions. The other thing is also some similar questions. You might have some probing questions. You may have some questions that kind of ask the same kind of stuff, but they're not exactly similar. You may want to randomize them so that they don't kind of be redundant and repetitive. So that prevents some kind of errors. For example, if I have the same kind of questions on math, English, and science, I would get so bored that I will start responding agree, 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 I don't care. So you may want to mix them up in such a way that the math questions are probably mixed with social studies, and then you give a gap of some open-ended questions and again bring back the math question or what have you. I'm just giving examples of education, the way I would design these questions. Again, I mentioned this already, have a mix of Likert scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and open-ended questions, because one, if somebody, I mean, not just somebody, but if you want some more holistic responses to your survey, you would also want some open-ended questions. Why? Why did you suppose somebody is like dissatisfied with the training and they just said strongly disagree, you would the follow-up question would be, if you have checked this strongly disagree, please mention why. Because that way you're not following up with a phone call or a focus group, but then you already have a response, some kind of response. And the beauty of this is that if you're doing an online survey, you could probably have a forced response, if and then. So you can train Qualtrics, you can also train Survey Monkey, saying that if you have a response of strongly disagree, then they have to complete the open-ended question. That way you are forcing them to respond. But again, it depends as to the extent to which you want to have these kinds of forced responses. To the question that the person asked, typically 8 to 10 questions are considered ideal, with 1 to 2 sub-questions to the maximum possible. That doesn't mean that every question will have a sub-question. It really depends if you want to have a sub-question. But I would say restrict it to 8 to 10 max questions, because nobody wants to get bored and they have better things to do than sit and do your survey. Then online survey is easier, I think, because then you can chunk it into different sections, especially if you're doing a Google form, which is free, you can make different pages. That kind of reduces the boring aspect of it. And then you can also have a small scale at the end, which says 30% complete, 50% complete, 80% complete. But again, it depends. Use some radio buttons versus some drop-down menus. Apparently, there is some research which says that when you use radio buttons compared to drop-down menu, the response rate is higher. Mainly because in the drop-down menus, what happens is you don't want people to spend time and looking for an answer. For instance, when you're filling out an online survey, oftentimes you'll have this question, well, what is the name of your state? And you're like, okay, Virginia, I just keep going to Virginia. And so many times I've just clicked on Virgin Islands because that's where I want to be. So I don't care about Virginia, just put Virgin Islands or some other place. So that's where the mistakes happen, when you have a pretty lengthy drop-down menu and you just like, I don't care, I'll just write something. Then always try to avoid technical jargons or terms. But sometimes it's unavoidable, especially when you are doing a technical survey. In that case, I would say, well, do a small abbreviation stuff. I mean, if you have acronyms, just spell it out so that people don't get bored, or they just forget what that means. So make sure that the survey is simple. Just think, if you got the survey, how would you want to complete it? Don't keep it longer than 8 to 10 questions, maybe multiple pages. Always ask the easier ones at the beginning and leave out the demographic questions towards the end. Be very, very mindful of the DEI type questions. Don't force them to respond to the questions that could be potentially sensitive. Any questions here?
I've got 3 questions. What survey method would you recommend when there's time pressure?
It would depend on your audience. If the audience is very tech savvy and you can go and get out very quickly, I would say go with an online, a very cell phone friendly survey. Now, here's the thing with cell phone survey is that when you develop a survey on Google form, it will give you a URL. Sometimes it is half a page length. So my trick is that copy that URL into tiny URL, make it really, really short, which has only probably 7 or 8 characters, and then embed that in your message. Don't put the lengthy survey link because it gets truncated and then nobody is ever able to open that survey, and it's totally useless.
Should you have a lot of questions that are very similar? So it's, oh, hold on. It popped up. Should you have a lot of questions that are very similar so it's easier for people to take, or questions that are varied in style to keep respondents on their toes?
This is where I think would be a classic case of one, depending on what kind of study you're doing. If you're talking about, say, a film, a movie, a very interesting movie, and you're asking opinion, then maybe you should mix them up. If you're asking about an education program, I would say that I would be very careful about how would I design that so that it doesn't get too boring. So the short answer is really depends. in any case, I would say keep the there's another one. Another method is I've also done in my study when I have two sets of surveys. One survey has a set of questions, and the other survey actually has another set of questions, but they both kind of ask similar kind of questions. The wordings are different. So you can also do that and still arrive at the same conclusion because the questions were a little mixed and matched. The wordings were really changed. So the short answer is it really depends on what you're trying to investigate.
So just two questions on the demographics. One's a comment that sometimes we put demographics at the beginning to screen for what set of questions would be next to ask. And then the question, having the demographics at the end of the survey, is it recommended for a survey within the community such as a household survey?
So the household survey, the census is pretty much all demographic. So you cannot like not have the demographic questions or just move them towards the end. So the census, you have no choice. But for some of the other studies, as you know, even Bev would say that, for even qualitative studies, she would probably save some of the mundane questions towards the end so that you don't waste the time that you have, that real estate of time with your participant. You don't want to lose them. So I would say that another thing that you could do if you are so pressed and you really want to ask a few demographic questions, ask one or two demographic questions right at the beginning and then save some of them towards the end. Or you can mix them one or two in the middle. At the end of the day, it really depends on what your study is all about. If it's merely about the number of children in the household, their education level, your income level, census, pretty much there's no escape. You have to ask those questions at the beginning and the end. It's all about that.
That's all for now.
Okay. All right. So moving further with the surveys, again, provide a reference frame in terms of be specific, always be on topic, and don't open up with a completely broad topic or question where you lose the interest and it was like, what did you ask? What does it mean? Make sure the scales that you're using are ordinal in the sense of you want to use choices of a lot, some, only a few, none at all, so that they have the choices. Then avoid double barrel question. For instance, you're really forcing a response out of the mouth of the participant by questioning, like, do you think the government should lower taxes and spending? I mean, they're both like, how can you do both? Then answer choices should anticipate all possibilities. Remember, as I mentioned, that to leave out the option of other, specify, prefer not to answer, not applicable, none, because that way you are easing the person into responding the way they want to respond. And then you don't want to piss them off saying that, well, they're really forcing me to respond to a gender question. I'm not feeling comfortable. And you don't want to lose the interest of your participant in just one question. So always make sure that you have all the possibilities there. Avoid using very leading, emotional, and evocative language. I mean, we already know that, again, goes back to the concept of being very mindful of your audience, being very mindful of your participant, and the participant's time is critical, especially if you are asking a favor of them. So be mindful of those. Okay. So these are some of the really good references. I think one of my favorite books has always been Creswell's book on mixed methods and research design. The reason I like this is because in the grad school, it was an easy read in the sense that John Creswell does a decent job of walking you through the process of designs, that the ones that I talked about. In this book, he also has some simple exercises. It has some quizzes, some worksheets. I think they've highly improved John Creswell's book since when I was in grad school. Then Campbell and Stanley, they do a decent job in terms of talking at length about experimental and quasi-experimental design. They go heavy into statistics. They go heavy into sampling and sampling methods and methodology. So if you're interested, this actually link talks about some of the basics of conducting experimental and quasi-experimental designs. Johnson and Christensen, they have a new book out as of 2019, they also very similarly talk about the research designs as Creswell does, and it's a little bit more advanced because Johnson and Christensen is used more often in the PhD level courses, while Creswell is used more in the master's courses. Fowler's book, I don't recall if he came out with the more recent version. The one that I have is the 1995 version. It is a little handbook kind of a thing, which is about survey questions, good questions, the do's, the don'ts, and also some samples. So Fowler's book also is actually pretty good if you want to look into survey design, survey questions, methods, and methodology. So I'm looking at the time here. Should I go through, scan through these slides real quickly, especially because these slides actually talk about the designs that I talked about with some examples. If you have this kind of question, what would be the research question and what would be the analytical technique that you would use? The most common one is one group post design, and the kind of questions is the extent to which participating in a program intervention influences an individual's ability to stay sober, or in what ways does participating in a seminar, training program may make you feel more confident in recognizing an individual who might present as a safety threat. So that's a typical example of a post test. And also training, seminar, professional development, we use a one group post test only. You will use descriptive statistics, and this is how the design is actually written when you have a one group post test. In any case, I'm going to scan through these. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, again, these slides will be made available to you, so please, use what you think is useful and appropriate for you. Somebody asked about the sequential design, so quantitative to qualitative or qualitative to quantitative. Then concurrent could be qual, quant, quant, qual, depending on, or they could be done simultaneously, depending on what you want to do. Triangulation is one of the most commonly used term because you're triangulating the data from different sources, qualitative, quantitative. It could be interviews, then some focus groups, surveys, extant data. You're triangulating the data from multi-methods. So another thing, those of you who have taken statistics course, and one of the common, or actually one of the popular tools, which is also free, is R, and it's a statistical program which is open source. And at least in my practice, we use R. We have stopped using SPSS and SAS because one, they are licensed tools, and you have to pay very high fees to keep maintaining them and having them on your machines. So that's R. There are two resources that I'm going to present, and you can learn. There are training programs, there are YouTube videos, and that's one of the more popular ways of conducting analysis. The flexibility in R is that you can actually do a lot of data visualizations in R. You can also do the same thing in Excel, but those who are interested in coding and doing programming, R is the way to go. Then matching techniques, this happens when you're conducting a quasi-experimental design or a randomized controlled trial where you want to make sure that your treatment and comparison groups are matched to the extent possible, apples to apples, oranges to oranges. So there are some techniques that statisticians use to come to that, so-called perfect match. Now, social networking analysis is another tool that is often used when you have a community program, for a public health program, for a big HR program where there are many partners, many stakeholders in different locations, in different places, and everybody has a common goal for a collective impact. Now, how do you make sure that there is cohesion? There is a common understanding and mission with so many different people. So there is a tool that we use to conduct the efficacy of a network, and it's called a social networking analysis, or SNA for short. This is R. This is how the R interface looks. Again, it's a free tool, but there is a learning curve, because if you haven't done coding or if you haven't used SAS, then it becomes a little difficult because you're learning everything from scratch. There are some advantages.
Kavita, there's a question. Is coding a necessary skill if you want to work in quant evaluations?
If you ask me, I would say yes, because it gives you the flexibility of doing high-level analysis. The point and click method generally doesn't work very well when you have very large data sets and you want to really do some beautiful data visualizations, infographics, heat maps. It gives you the flexibility to actually be more innovative and also more creative. So it's your choice. If you are a very quant person and you want to learn new things, you want to do new things with large data sets, then coding would be really helpful.
Do you have any recommendations for online courses or other resources to help us develop our skills?
For coding?
To develop skills in R.
Okay, in R. Okay, so there are several people who are actually offering training. Not sure if I should name them because I'm not marketing them, but the thing is, people are providing workshops, especially statisticians. But there is one person who actually used to work in my company, and then he is actually a trainer in R, and his website is rfortherestofus.com. R as in just the R for therestofus.com. And the person behind this is David Keyes, David Keyes. He is an excellent coder, and he is really, which makes it even more interesting because he is actually an anthropologist by training, and he became a coder. So he does the things the way the rest of us will actually understand, because he comes from social sciences and he does beautiful graphs. One of the links that I shared with you, Bev, yesterday, the arts integration, was developed by David. So I think that would be a good example of, he makes things simple yet very beautiful and very reachable and very easy to understand for the common man. Highly recommend. And his training sessions are not very expensive, and he does a fantastic job.
A couple of questions. What coding language do you recommend for quantitative analysis? And related, which is relatively easier language to learn for non-coding people?
So the easier one would be the point and click. If you're comfortable with Excel, I think you will like SPSS, because SPSS gives you the flexibility of both coding and or use a point and click method, because it has the same interface as Excel does. Now, if you really want to get into coding and R, then I think these days the fashionable word is machine learning, because they say that machine learning has even more flexibility, and Python, because Python is much more advanced than R, it is much more flexible. But if you have a complicated data set, that's when you do Python coding, very advanced. Otherwise, you can just make do with Excel and SPSS.
I think I don't have any more questions.
Okay, so these are two good resources for R, especially if you're transitioning from SAS and or SPSS. This is a really good book. And then the other one is using R for program evaluation. One of my staff members actually uses both of them, and he said, well, I think these are highly recommended books for anyone who wants to delve into R and learning R from scratch.
A question from Judith about Stata.
I have actually not used Stata. I've used SPSS, a little bit of SAS, and then my staff uses R because my staff says I'm untrainable.
There we go. Are there any other last questions? We're coming about to the end of time.
Okay. This is an example of social network analysis, especially if you have many players in a program. You want to know, well, how efficacious is the network itself? What is the strength and beauty of the network? Who is interacting with whom? Who is the queen bee here? I think social network analysis is the way to go. Okay, there you go.
What if you do not have time to test your surveys?
Well, in most cases, we generally don't have the time, and we just have to launch the survey and pray that you get at least 30% response, and that's considered actually good news for social sciences. And just go from there, and just make sure that the surveys, whatever you send, is not tedious, it's not lengthy. At least it's a doable survey, and just make sure that people will respond at some point.
Any other last questions? I know you had lots of really interesting slides with information on different quant designs, evaluation designs, and I think that students would be really interested in having a look at those. So I will be sending them through to our program director, who will email them. And then the students can and alums can look at those and self-learn from your slides.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Excellent. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to either ask Bev, or if you're my student, you have my email. I think there's a question from Anusha, one of my students. Hey, Anusha. Any recommended books for data analysis? Latest one. SPSS used to come out with a kind of a guidebook, handbook for data analysis. That was a really good one. I would say, yeah, look it up if they still have it, because I have an older version, and I actually learned SPSS using that book.
Wonderful. Well, everyone is writing their thanks in the chat. Everyone learned a lot and had a great time. Loved your jokes, but loved your information on quantitative methods and design more. But thanks very much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Yeah. Stay safe, everybody.
Yep. And really appreciate the time you took with us.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.